To travel through Canada by train is to discover the country the way the first explorers and settlers did, by land and along great rivers, through lakes, hills, and mountains. Great railways bind this vast country from sea to sea, and along their winding routes there is much to explore. Our journey begins in Atlantic Canada, from the rocky shores of Nova Scotia to the rugged coast of Newfoundland and the remote islands of the St. Lawrence. Our railway adventures take us on the Brador through Cape Breton, along the old trails of Newfoundland, through Nova Scotia on the ocean, and into the Gaspé Peninsula on the Chaleur. Our entree to Atlantic Canada is at Halifax, which boasts the world's second largest natural harbor. The city began as a British garrison in 1749. Once ever watchful of the French fortress at Louisbourg near Sydney. Nowadays, the Brador, a summertime rail excursion, links these two historic cities. Nova Scotia, the very name means New Scotland, and with its rugged highlands, it was aptly named by Scottish Highlanders who found sanctuary in a land that felt so much like home. For some travelers, riding the Brador is a way to reconnect with their roots.
I've always been fascinated with Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island. I didn't realize that Cape Breton Island was a separate part of Nova Scotia. That's why I chose to come on the train. And my heritage is Ireland and Scotland, so it speaks to my soul.
It's a unique way to see this part of Cape Breton, especially because the rail line travels through an area that would not normally be traveled by people traveling from the Strait area to the Sydneys or on to Louisbourg.
Good morning, folks. Did you care for a copy of the newspaper? Got it? Would you like to have the provincial edition?
Oh, yeah.
Get caught up on the local news?
Yeah.
Folks are okay?
For passengers catching the train, an early morning wake-up call comes with a morning newspaper and breakfast wrapped in Nova Scotia tartan. The route from Halifax to Sydney threads its way through towns and villages settled by early pioneers. At Grand Narrows, the train passes over the Canso Causeway. Some 50 years ago, millions of tons of rock were hewn from Cape Porcupine to link Cape Breton Island forever to the mainland. Just after crossing St. Peter's Canal, it's time to stretch your legs and perhaps do a little shopping at Port Hawkesbury. The Brador rumbles on through Orangedale, the last original intercolonial railway station house left in Canada. In its heyday, it was one of the busiest stations on Cape Breton Island.
The station we're standing in now was built in 1886. On the first floor would be the station master's office and the waiting room, and then the visitor can go upstairs and see where the station master lived.
The sun has begun its westward trek as the train rounds Brador, the world's largest saltwater lake. Over the Grand Narrows Railway Bridge, and 11 hours after leaving Halifax, the train arrives in Sydney. Centuries before Scottish Highlanders settled Cape Breton, the French were here at a lonely coastal outpost called Louisbourg. The fortress of Louisbourg, one of Canada's finest historic sites, was built in the early 1700s to guard the Gulf of St. Lawrence and protect France's dwindling empire in the New World. Louisbourg's stone walls are 3 meters thick and 9 meters high and bristle with 148 cannon. Strolling this magnificent reconstruction is to step back into the 18th century, but Louisbourg's time on the world stage was brief. The French fort was soon captured by the British, and control went back and forth between the two superpowers until finally England built its own garrison, Halifax. Nova Scotia would soon become home to the United Empire Loyalists, as thousands of supporters of the British cause fled the American Revolution. Many Loyalists were Americans of British descent. Others were French Huguenots, Dutch and German. Over the years, many blacks would seek refuge because of Canada's anti-slavery laws. The multicultural pattern of Canadian immigration had begun. Atlantic Canada's maritime history and the stunning scenery come together in the village of Peggy's Cove. The rugged little fishing community nestles in a narrow ocean inlet, dominated by a lighthouse high atop granite boulders. Legend has it that the cove was named for Peggy, the lone survivor of a shipwreck who married one of the local inhabitants. It's an artist's and photographer's mecca. William de Garth, who was born in 1907 in Finland, came to Peggy's Cove in 1926, and during his lifetime carved these granite rocks into a living monument to Canadian fishermen. Between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, the power of the sea rules life in the Bay of Fundy, where the highest tides in the world are generated.
The mouth of the Bay of Fundy between Yarmouth and Bar Harbor, Maine is 90 miles across. Between Digby and St. John, it's 45 miles across. And at Cape Split, it's 5 miles across. So you have all this water rushing in into a funnel-shaped bay, and it has nowhere to go but up. The same thing is happening here on this river, and the water is forcing up into a narrower river all the time, you see. And this is what creates a bore. When we first saw it coming around the bend, it was traveling approximately 10 miles an hour.
Just a ferry or flight away from Nova Scotia is St. John's, the heart and capital of Newfoundland. The trains may be gone, but their historic railbeds have been preserved as walking trails. You'll also need sturdy walking shoes for the hills and steps of St. John's and its historic harbor.
We have about 500 years of history and culture and tradition. So it's quite old in terms of its tradition and its makeup. But the water was key. It was all important, and it was the heart of why we were here.
A tradition started by early settlers has left its mark on this city's colorful architecture, like Elaine Hand's grand old home.
The wind blew the paint off the house last year, so you have to paint it again this year. So really it's painted with whatever they had at the time. So what you had then was a hodgepodge of color that was actually part of the charm of the city.
Along St. John's Grand Concourse are trails that lead through many of its heritage buildings, churches, and cathedrals. Some trails lead to Signal Hill.
You don't want to be too faint of heart, but this trail here is called the North Head Trail, and it actually begins at the base of the hill and will come right around the face, and there'll be a series of steps that'll take you right back up to the top of the hill and to Cabot Tower.
And from there you can see Fort Amherst and Newfoundland's first lighthouse, which has guarded the Narrows for 2 centuries. Another lighthouse at Cape Spear, the most easterly point of land in North America, has been guiding mariners in and out of St. John's Harbor for more than 160 years. If the soul of Newfoundland is in its people, then the spirit is in George Street.
Well, George Street is known because it's a very small street, but it has the largest number of bars per capita than anywhere else in North America. You can have a drink in a pub where you will hear traditional Newfoundland live entertainment, and you can go and have a scuff and a good time.
The trains may be gone, but the terminus building remains, though the maid of industry had little to do once the railway was decommissioned in 1991. In 1997, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador turned the old railbed into a provincial park. The cleverly named Newfoundland Trailway Provincial Park is a 900-kilometer trail that winds across Newfoundland from St. John's to Port aux Basques. Another branch of the railroad, south around the Avalon Peninsula, is a hiking trail. And a scenic drive around the Irish Loop, as it's called, takes you to Bay Bulls, where you can cruise out to see Witless Bay Ecological Reserve's millions of seabirds.
Puffins aren't really designed, you see, for flying. Puffins aren't supposed to fly, technically. Their wings are too small for their bodies. Sometimes they eat so much that they can't take flight. They're skipping across the top of the water, and it's quite comical. And they try to take off, and they just go flat on their face back in the water.
Hiking the East Coast Trail leads you around the Avalon Peninsula into places like La Manche, once a fishing port, now a ghost town. In the 1960s, during the era of resettlement in Newfoundland, La Manche was deserted. A lot of what was left was washed away a few years later by a rogue wave.
This house would have been owned by a family that fished here, from the 30s on up, but no one's been living here, I'd say, since the early 60s. So it's just kind of fallen down. Every year when I come out here, it gets a little bit more dilapidated.
About an hour south of St. John's is a coastal community of Fairyland and the colony of Avalon. It's here that archaeologists are uncovering the remains of Lord Baltimore's settlement with finds that date back to 1621.
Somebody's always finding something when you're here, because we find something every few seconds, really, when the full gang is on. Just this spring, one of the fellows, Barry Galton, found a little tiny thimble that belonged to a child, a sewing thimble. And we don't often find very many objects that we can associate with children.
Satisfied with that?
At the bottom of the Irish Loop, the landscape changes dramatically, and it's not unusual to come across a herd of caribou and even the occasional moose. The building of railway lines also opened up recreational areas in Newfoundland.
People used to ride the rail to access cabin areas, access berry picking areas, hunting areas, and by maintaining and preserving the trailway as a provincial park, we're still preserving those traditional types of lifestyles.
In the fall, I usually do a little rabbit catching along the line. You can do anything here. It's easy going. The only thing you have to watch out for is loose rock in some places, where the rock is not packed down right. Otherwise, it's as good as the highway.
Just off the trailway on the west coast of Newfoundland is Grossmoor National Park, with its coastal lowlands bordering the Gulf of St. Lawrence and an alpine plateau in the Long-Range Mountains.
The rocks of Grossmoor are as old as 600 million years. There's lots of evidence of ancient volcanoes, and there's also ancient seas have been here, so wonderful place for fossils.
Grossmoor is now a World Heritage Site, primarily because of the number of geological features in the park.
We have the tablelands, which are peridotite. It's effectively that part of the continent that's normally in contact with molten lava flipped upside down.
So where you have the calcium and the nitrogen coming out in the groundwater, you have the lush vegetation that you see here. Areas where there are few springs, you get little low-growing, ground-hugging plants that can tolerate the high magnesium and iron, and they're more like Arctic alpine species.
As a consequence, this is a very diverse place. Even though it's part of the boreal forest, which ordinarily isn't all that diverse. In Grossmoor, you can see all kinds of things from different ecological zones. And so to me, that's what's special about it.
In the far north of Newfoundland, at Lanceau Meadows, you'll also find solid evidence of Vikings. This World Heritage Site marks the lonely outpost of the first Europeans to set foot in North America more than 1,000 years ago.
It's the only authenticated Viking settlement in North America. And also on the site, we have the remains of 8 buildings. Also on the site, we have 4 reconstructed sod buildings. We have the longhouse and a workshop and a smithy and a storage building, whereby people can go in these houses and see what the actual remains would have looked like 1,000 years ago.
Archaeological digs in the 1960s uncovered this bronze ring-headed pin, as well as butternuts which helped crack the mystery of the Nordic colony of Vinland.
Butternuts grow in northern New Brunswick, which is the same place where they would have been able to find grapes. So we think that Lanceau Meadows is a gateway to Vinland, whereby they built their base camp, but they also explored further south, where they would have been able to harvest the timber, grapes, and butternuts. So Vinland is a region as opposed to one small place on the map.
At a nearby replica settlement called Norstead, costumed guides really take you back in time.
My name is Egil Kveld Ulf. Egil the Evening Wolf. With a face like this, you can see why, can't you?
I'm making cups or bowls. It's made of it's birch wood.
This is capelin. It's been salted and dried.
The Vikings did not live in a lot of comfort, and 1,000 years later, railway passengers sometimes had to bunk down at the station. But for today's traveler, there are places like Strawberry Hill. Beyond the barren mounds at Lanceau Meadows, you may meet a baby berg near the shore at Iceberg Alley.
Bon voyage.
Icebergs come in sizes. A bergy bit is like a small car. A growler like this one is smaller, about the size of a grand piano.
Okay, now that we've seen the calf, we'll go see the mother. So one day you can come around a corner and all of a sudden there's this massive berg there. Someone referred to them one time as vast cathedrals of ice. And they look different every day because they're rolling over, they're breaking apart. They've got colors in them. You get the light behind them and you see that almost like winter green or bright blue coming through them.
It's hard to imagine that this impressive mountain of fresh water is just one small chunk off the massive glaciers from Greenland and the Arctic. From a kayak, it's possible to explore the iceberg from almost every angle. But because they can be somewhat unstable, it's wise to keep your distance. Imagine what you see is only 1/10 of what's beneath the surface. And imagine what it would have been like for sailors trying to navigate through icebergs, islands, and the rocky shores of Newfoundland.
The lighthouse itself was opened in the 1860s, and it's been staffed since then. The present house was built in 1922, the main inn. This is a great spot for icebergs, and this is the tip of what they call Iceberg Alley. It's where all the icebergs come down the coast of Labrador and then spread out along the north and east coast of Newfoundland, and we're at the top of that. So the icebergs stay here long into the season.
For another uniquely Newfoundland experience, try Jig's Dinner.
It's a rough food meal. It's very filling, but it's tasty. It's a meal that all Newfoundlanders grew up with, right? The main day for it being served was on Sunday, and today is Sunday, so you've hit on the right day to have a Newfoundland dinner.
Carrots, cabbage, potatoes, salted beef, it all goes into one pot and boils up together. And another crucial ingredient is peas pudding. No trip to Newfoundland is complete without a fresh seafood dinner. Start with some tender cod tongues, then lobster fixed in many ways, from stew to spring rolls, not to mention the old favorite, boiled lobster with lemon butter for dipping. Newfoundland is covered with wild berries, so it's not surprising they pop up in many different dishes.
Yeah, there's a local berry, and it's a delicacy. You only find it in certain kinds of bogs. Locally, it's called bake apples. It has nothing to do with apples and nothing to do with being baked. I don't know where the name came from. It looks more almost like a brown raspberry more than anything else. In other areas, it's known as a cloudberry, and from that, you make a liqueur.
Some of the trains that used to take Newfoundlanders to their best berry picking spots can be seen now in Corner Brook at the Humberside Rail Museum, where Brendan Dix, a former engineer, is the curator.
We have the only steam engine that's available on the island. It's inoperative, but it's the only steam engine left alive. And we have the only working diesel-electric locomotive, which is a 1,200 horsepower General Motors diesel-electric.
The dining car is still set for lunch, and the sleeping berth looks as if someone bunked there last night. When the last train stopped here at the railroad town of Humbermouth, all the railroad employees stood beside the tracks to watch the passing of the railway in Newfoundland. Nowadays, a train journey across Canada starts in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the eastern seaport, where so many immigrants first set foot. They disembarked at Pier 21, which is now a museum and a testament to the immigrant experience.
People would be unloaded into this room here, and also they would be processed, welcomed into Canada, and then at the end of that process, we could take, anywhere from 2 hours to 8 hours in length, depending on the number of people on the ship and so on. You would get your supplies for the train ride across Canada.
Immigrants arriving in the 1930s would still face a long overland journey to Saskatchewan and Alberta. At Pier 21, you can cross Canada in minutes.
Well, the train exhibit offers people a glimpse into what it may have been like for immigrants who would have gone onto the train. It's a 10-minute train ride across Canada. It starts in Halifax, ends in Vancouver.
Immigrants weren't the only ones facing an uncertain future.
It was also very important with World War II because all of the troops left Canada from Pier 21 to fight overseas in Europe. They all came by train.
You can still stay at the original train hotel, although it's undergone a few renovations, additions, and name changes since it was built in 1930.
The lobby has changed a bit, but it's still very reminiscent of the original hotel. And if you go into our promenade lounge, the ceiling work with all of the copper leafing and such is still the same, and it's fabulous.
Passengers often overnight here before boarding the Ocean, the longest running passenger train in Canadian history. In the heady days of immigration, the Ocean traveled all the way across Canada. Passengers get on the train at Halifax Station, and once on board, you're en route through Nova Scotia to New Brunswick. At the mouth of the Petitcodiac River in New Brunswick, these small islands only appear at high tide. Over the millennia, the 15-meter tides that surge up the Bay of Fundy have sculpted the soft rock into what look like flower pots atop reddish pillars in the Rocks Provincial Park.
Fundy is hill country. Hills going up to 366 meters or 1,200 feet above sea level. So all of Fundy is rugged topography, steep hills, deep river valleys, fast-flowing rivers, waterfalls, all going down to the Bay of Fundy shoreline.
Mary's Point Shorebird Reserve puts on a kind of air show. Birds on their annual migrations swoop through in amazing flying formations.
When they have completed their nesting in the Arctic, then they pass through here in hundreds of thousands. We call them sandpipers, but there are about 10 different species of those birds. They stop for about 10 days, and they feed, and they get fat, and they fuel up, because then from here, right from this point, they fly from 40 to 60 hours non-stop to South America.
Listening to the birds, it's easy to understand how the nearby Tantramar marshes got their names, from the French Tantamar, meaning uproar. These marshes, called the world's biggest hayfield, are protected from the sea by dikes built by 17th century Acadian settlers.
Tantramar was settled as early as 1672 by a gentleman named Jacques Bourgeois, who came with 5 families, and the Acadian population of this area grew until the deportation in 1755.
Here at Fort Beauséjour, you can appreciate the tremendous isolation under which the Acadians lived. Caught between the ongoing British and French wars, the Acadians refused to take sides, but the British, not convinced of their neutrality, deported them. The majority ended up in the French colony of Louisiana, where they became known as Cajuns. They say Prince Edward Island is no longer an island, ever since the Confederation Bridge was thrown across the Northumberland Straits. Like Newfoundland, only the railway right-of-way remains. 275 kilometers of track that once linked North Cape with East Point has now been converted into the Confederation Trail. The trail is aptly named, for it was here in Charlottetown, the capital of Canada's smallest and most densely populated province, that Confederation was conceived. The idea of joining the colonies of British North America was tied to the dream of building a transcontinental railroad. This would be key to the future, vital for trade and Western settlement, and crucial in the defense against a growing threat from the Americans. In 1864, Upper and Lower Canada learned that the Atlantic provinces might form their own union. So a delegation boarded the Queen Victoria along with $13,000 worth of champagne and set sail for Prince Edward Island, to be met by a single oyster boat. It seems their arrival was eclipsed by the first ever visit of the circus. In spite of their low-key welcome, the Ottawa delegation persevered, and the banns of matrimony were proclaimed. 3 years later, a nation was born. From nation building in Charlottetown to a national park on the north side of the province. Here, some of North America's finest white sand beaches fringe the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The park is renowned for its great dune lands, salt marshes, and freshwater ponds. Within its boundaries can be found Green Gables, the farmhouse immortalized by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Her mother died when she was 22 months old, and then from there she was taken down to her Cavendish home and raised by her grandparents, the McNeils, down in Cavendish.
And what I always argue that she had to have that loneliness in Cavendish to write. And people have said they'd see her at 3 or 4 in the morning roaming the fields. I suppose she was getting books put together, characters thought out.
Well, I think Anne, as Lucy Maud says herself, is her imagination, based on certain real things that happened to her in her life. But Anne is a creation of Lucy Maud Montgomery's mind.
Prince Edward Island is really a beautiful province, the most beautiful place in America, I believe. Elsewhere are more lavish landscapes and grander scenery, but for chaste, restful loveliness, it is unsurpassed. Compassed by the inviolate sea, it floats on the waves of the Blue Gulf, a green seclusion and haunt of ancient peace.
Returning to New Brunswick, we rejoin the ocean train at Moncton and head for Couchibouguac National Park.
There's so much within the province of New Brunswick. Certainly the southeast coast of New Brunswick, which has the beaches and shorelines and the natural habitats, which have gone relatively undiscovered for many, many years. And the reason Couchibouguac National Park was established to preserve that part of Canada's heritage, the Barrier Island system. It's basically a nursery for many of the fish and small organisms that live along this coast, and many of the birds and seals and other organisms feed on. The dunes are a very fragile system, and it's maintained by marram grass.
The dunes also provide an ideal nesting area for the terns.
natives people, the First Nations, fished in these waters, and they camped along these coasts, and they traveled and transported goods and supplies inland through the river systems. And then later came the Acadians, who settled along the coast.
The history of the Acadians is on display at Le Pays de la Saguine, an interpretive center and showcase for the literary works of Antonine Maillet.
Et de l'angle du docteur Chase pour toutes les maladies de la peau. Venez, j'en ai pour tous les goûts. Et du sirop Lambert pour les coups de haleine, les pneumoniques et les consumptions. Tout ce qu'il faut pour les crochus, les tordus, les morveux, les esclopés.
Qu'est-ce que vous voulez, mes petits cochons? Je gage que vous aimeriez ça avoir du pays, hein? Hey! Ça vous tenterait pas de prendre de large un beau matin pour les mers du Sud?
They created Le Pays de la Saguine, a theme park to underline the works of Antonine Maillet, which is an international Acadian author. Antonine Maillet is a woman that's solidly connected to her roots, Acadian roots.
You don't erase history, but I've always felt that being part of that ethnic group, you know, was good for me, and I've always been proud of it. And I've always appreciated the efforts that our great-great-great-parents made to survive.
From Rogersville, the ocean train runs north to Matapedia, where you can connect with the Chaleur and travel along the southern shores of the Gaspé Peninsula. Tucked between Nouvelle and Carleton is Parc de Miguasha, recently added to the list of World Heritage Sites. This is the Prince of Miguasha, the fossilized fish that helped paleontologists understand the evolution from fish to amphibian. Almost 400 million years ago in the Devonian period, there were no amphibians, no reptiles or mammals. When the transition from water to land occurred, it left behind, right here, evidence of each stage of that remarkable development.
It's a paleo-ecosystem that has been preserved. We have the fish, we have the fern, we have the invertebrate, we have scorpions, we have water scorpions, we have traces of worms. So the whole ecosystem is buried in Miguasha. And it's only 8 kilometers long. So can you imagine, of all the surface of the earth, 8 kilometers only of Miguasha, we comprehend how a fish evolved into a tetrapod. So we're still looking for an animal with a 5-finger hand or even 6-finger. I wouldn't mind the 6th one, but it has to have legs. Walking on land.
Guarding the eastern end of the Gaspé Peninsula is Percé Rock, a great block of limestone rising 86 meters out of the sea. Nearby on Bonaventure Island lives the world's largest colony of gannets.
We're talking about a bird brain, but a very smart bird brain with a little computer that knows exactly where it's nesting among these 60,000 gannets. While they're flying in, they'll call, and the one that's sitting on the nesting site will answer. And for us, it's all the same, rah, 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 continually. But for them, it's different patterns of calling, so even the neighbor gets to know who's coming in.
Parc National Forillon stands at the tip of the Gaspé Peninsula.
We have a very popular event here that we've been doing for 17 years now. It brings people into contact, direct contact with what's living in the sea in Forillon. We dive for the public who stays on the beach, and we go and pick up specimens that live to about 100 meters from the shore, and bring back these specimens to aquaria that are on the beach. An aquarium for every group, and the naturalist there explains what these animals are about and how they mate and how they eat and who preys on whom. We feel it's our job to build up an awareness that we don't know much about what's living in the sea around our country. Most things that we know are just concerning the species that we fish commercially, whereas all the rest of the wildlife has an importance also.
The dramatic scenery of winter in the Gaspé Peninsula attracts photographers and adventurers. Limestone cliffs plunge into the sea at Forillon. Inland, the McGarricles and the Chickjawks stand tall as eastern Canada's highest mountains. The unusual vegetation is a curious mix of boreal forest and alpine plants more often found in subarctic conditions.
For French, Canada is like a dream because of the land, because of the space. So my two friends of France come to rejoin me in Montreal. In Gaspésie, in France, is very known by an interest of tourism. So we decided to make a trip in Gaspésie, and we chose this morning because of the snow. The snow fall down this night, so it's a beautiful trip.
And for many locals and visitors, it is here in these parks that winter comes alive. Snowmobilers explore almost 7,000 kilometers of dedicated trails. And for the very daring, try scaling a wall of ice. Plenty of snow means you can ski from the end of November to mid-April. Diehards have even found snow at the top of Mont Albert in the Parc de la Gaspésie in July.
The park is mainly a wooded area, but there's about 20 summits which reach over 1,000 meters. Most of those summits are bare, so people can reach easily bare ground and with it enjoy skiing in a natural snowfield.
And at the end of the day, relax in the heart of the Parc de la Gaspésie at one of the many comfortable inns. Between the parks, you'll see a number of famous landmarks. In the spring, a flight from Gaspé takes you to the Magdalen Islands. From there, by helicopter, you reach the ice floes of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where seal pups are spending their first few days of life.
First thing you should do when you get there is take it all in. You know, the landscape, the scenery is totally different. Your own sea ice, the noise, the wind blowing, the seals crying. Get the atmosphere first, and then start taking pictures if you want. But just enjoy the first half hour. It's worth it. It's a unique wildlife experience. It's very fantastic. You're in a nursery ground for seals. You know, nowhere else on Earth can you do something like that.
It's only possible because winter pack ice forms in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Each year, around the end of February, thousands of pregnant harp seals haul themselves out of the water onto the ice. They'll find some roughly contoured ice that provides shelter from the frigid winds and give birth.
When they're first born, the harp seals are yellowish and very skinny. They start putting fat very rapidly. They grow about 2 kilograms per day.
The Magdalens are a relatively unknown part of Quebec. In the 16th century, Jacques Cartier wrote the first accounts of this archipelago. Along the string of 12 islands, 7 are inhabited, and most of these are connected by long, narrow sand dunes. All in all, 300 kilometers of the best beaches in Canada. La Grave is an important historic site on the islands. The town's name comes from the French word grève, which means pebbly and sandy beach. La Grave has its share of trendy cafes where you can meet the locals, les Madelinots. The Magdalen Islands have a reputation for excellent cuisine, much of it based naturally on the sea.
Ocean perch, the flounder, the cod, crab, the sea snails. Of course, all from the islands, and the vegetables too, especially in summertime.
La Grave's main street is lined with craft and souvenir shops where artists like France Pinchot are eager to talk about their work.
I take mold from natural seashells I find here on the beaches, and then with the mold I can reproduce them in sterling or in gold. One of the most popular designs are the sand dollars, because it's rare to find them here, and when we find them we say it's a lucky charm. So it's always the favorite pieces for the people who visit the Magdalen Islands.
There's no shortage of nautical themes. Perhaps the most famous studio on the islands is Les Artisans du Sable, the artists of the sand.
We use only natural sands. We don't dye the sand, and we have many, many colors. We start by mixing the sand with a kind of glue, and we make blocks. And after about an hour and a half, the block is solid. And we can work on it. We can turn it on a wood lathe. We can sculpt it, like if it was a piece of wood.
The sands of the island are also turned into glass at La Méduse. Indoors and outdoors, the Magdalen Islands, Les Îles de la Madeleine, charm visitors and inspire artists with a glorious palette of colors. The Magdalene's red rock cliffs are best seen from offshore in a zodiac. Or, if you're up to it, in a sea kayak.
We have all type of tourism, but most of the people that come here are very nature orientated, which is very good because we don't want to have big condominiums here. You know, it's a virgin place, and we want to keep it that way.
You can fly back to Gaspé and return on the Chaleur train to Matapedia for a different perspective on all the historic and cultural sites that make this peninsula so intriguing. Over the trestles, through the towns, and alongside the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the junction of two great rivers, the Matapedia and the Restigouche, where some of the finest salmon in the world is caught.
Started 12-year-old. This is my 70th summer guiding. I've been guiding on the Restigouche maybe 18 years or so, and on the Matapedia over 50 years. Most of the Americans came here first and built the camps over 100 years ago. I started guiding the president of the IEP, R.J. Cullen, John Hinman, this girl's father-in-law, and so on, and Jimmy Carter, and doctors and lawyers. We give them all the same service. If it's a girl, we give her a few more smiles.
One of these camps, Estevan Lodge, was built on the banks of the Métis River in 1886 by the controversial president of the CPR, Stephen George. He later gave the property to his niece, Elsie Reeford, who designed a magnificent garden that benefits from the unusual microclimate created by the humid air rising from the junction of the St. Lawrence and Métis rivers. Himalayan blue poppies, rhododendrons, azaleas, and gentians share space with 1,000 other indigenous and exotic species. At Jardin des Métis, spring flowers bloom long after their season has officially ended. Right where the St. Lawrence River spills into the Gulf, there are isolated refuges like Quarry and Anticosti Islands.
Quarry Island is interesting for birds, but also because of the rock formations, the monoliths that you find there.
I travel around the world and I didn't see a place, a natural place with such unusual rocks and natural place.
It also has different types of environment like peat bog and boreal forest, so that's interesting.
And then there's Anticosti.
It's 220 kilometers long, 56 kilometers wide, right in the middle of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. You have 270 people living there, 120,000 deer, about 27 salmon rivers. There's such an immense property there, and so few people and a lot of wildlife.
Here at Boreal Falls, over tens of thousands of years, this small stream has carved a fantastic canyon through the rock. Then it's back to Rimouski to reconnect with the ocean and board the overnight train to North America's jewel of historic treasures, Quebec City, to continue your railway adventures across Canada.